Today's tutorial is about applying a basic binding to your quilt. We're going to sew it on the front by machine and we're going to hand sew it to the back to finish it. So this quilt that I have today is just a little Western style quilt. It measures 40 inches by 50 inches. So our calculations are that we would need 5 strips of fabric to do our binding. Our strips are cut 2.5 inches wide by the width of your fabric. I prefer to use 2.5 inches for my bindings. So the first thing I'm going to do is get these salvage edges cut off of here. When I do that, I line my strip of fabric up on a line on my cutting mat to make sure that I'm getting a nice straight cut on that edge. So I can put 2 together. I don't like to stack them more than 2, and so I'm going to line up the 2 on one line, and then I'm going to go up a little ways and line up 2 more on another line, and then I have one single one left that I'm going to line up down here. And that way I can go ahead and cut all of these edges at the same time. So I'll line up my ruler and I'll get rid of those edges. I'm going to move over just a little bit because I want to make sure that I get all of the salvage edge cut off of the end of there. And you're going to do that on both ends of the strips. So I already have the other end done. So we've got the salvage edges cut off of this strip. Now I'm going to piece these together. So I'm going to start with one strip on my cutting mat, and I'm going to lay it out. It is coming from the left hand side, and I'm going to lay it out so that it is right side, and I'm going to lay it down on the first strip, and I'm going to make an upside down L with this strip. Now notice that I do have both sides offset just a little bit, so I can start in this corner and I can stitch down to this corner, and so I have a guide marker in there as to where I need to stitch. Now I'm going to line up my ruler from that inside point up here to the point down here, and I'm going to draw a line. You can use chalk markers. I also like to use this Choco Liner pen. Is one of my favorite pieces to use. I believe that the friction pen is going to show up better on my piece of fabric. So today I'm using the friction pen, and that will go away with the iron. Now I do not use the friction pens on anything that is on the front side. I only use it on things that are on the back side, just in case it doesn't play nice with my fabric. So I have this strip now marked from corner to corner, and I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place so I can take it over to my machine. I'm going to go forward with all of my strips, so this is going to be one seam here. So then I take this added piece here, and that is going to become my strip that is right side up coming from the left. Then the next strip will be right side down, making that upside down L. So we'll line these up and mark them. And I'll put a couple of pins in there to hold it nice and snug for me. And I'm going to continue down until I have all of my strips pinned together and marked to sew. Okay, now I am ready to sew all of my seams. I do not put my pins in first because my ruler will not be accurate with trying to lay on these pins. And so that is why I pin them last. Now I'm going to go over to my machine and I'm going to sew these pieces together here. And we're just going to sew directly onto that line. Now I do have my 1/4 inch foot on there, although just following the line is all that I need. And I do have my stitch length shortened to 2.0. And I can chain sew these, or I can go ahead and cut my thread in between each seam. So let me find the next one. Be sure that you don't sew over those pins. That's not healthy for your machine. Okay, all my seams are sewn. So now we're going to go to the ironing board and we're going to iron these. I'm going to move this aside. Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to do with these seams is I'm going to press them flat. And so this is setting the seam. So if you're pressing it nice and flat, you're just preparing that seam to be pressed in the direction that you would like it to be pressed in. So I'm going to press it flat first. I'm going to grab this first side and I'm going to pull it up and just use the edge of my iron to run along that seam line there and press it nice and flat. Then I can open it up from the back side and I can press this down nice and flat. And then as a final check, I'm going to bring it over to the front side and I'm going to make sure that I have that seam all pressed out nice and flat. A little shot of steam right there never is going to hurt. So we'll just get that pressed nice and flat and we'll continue until we have all of them pressed. So step 1 is pressing flat from the back side, pulling up the top layer, pressing it, opening it up so that it lays flat. Press that one, and then from the front side. And from the front side is where you can fine tune and make sure you don't have any foldovers on that binding edge. Okay, all right, there's our next one. If you let the iron sit on there for just a little bit, then the heat of the iron can do a big job for you. Okay, and last one. All right, now we have to trim out these extra pieces that we sewed onto here. We don't want that bulk in our binding, so we're going to trim those out. Now you can do this by scissors if you would like to just guess at where that 1/4 inch is. I prefer to do this by rotary cutter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my 1/4 inch mark on my ruler on my stitching line so that this is what I'm going to trim away. So I'm going to be left with a 1/4 inch seam. And so I'm going to trim that one, and you see you have left with these little dog ear pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and just trim that straight with my binding strip there. And this one over here as well, I'm just going to trim it straight up. And your goal is that you end up, I'm going to get rid of this little thread there, you end up with your binding that is going to be a continuous line, nice and straight. So let's get the rest of those seams trimmed up. All right. Now we have to prepare our binding to be sewn onto our quilt, and we're not going to put it on when it is this wide. So we're going to press this in half along the whole length of this binding with our wrong sides together. So match up your top edges here so that we have nice, even, consistent binding, and we're just going to proceed down the whole length of the binding and have it pressed in half. So if you started with 2.5 inch wide strips, you're going to end up with 1 1/4 inch when you're at this point. So this will take just a little bit to go ahead and press them in half. Now, I am sliding my iron along it, although I'm picking it up just a little bit before I move it, so I'm not really firmly sliding it along there. You have to control the weight of the iron. So Okay, we're on our last strip, and if you can see that as I'm moving along there, sometimes I just bounce the iron. So I'll line up my edge and I'll just bounce my iron along there and let it sit. And that way I'm not actually ironing where I'm pushing against that fabric. So if I try to iron and push, it can stretch my fabric. Okay, we are down to the end. And so our strip is pressed in half and is ready now to sew onto the quilt. So we're going to have this. I have already prepared the edge of the quilt by trimming off my extra batting and backing off of the quilt. So when I do that, when I trim it, I try to take a measurement from this inside edge of the border out, and I trim it even amount all the way around. So I'm actually going to apply the binding to the front side of this quilt so I can bring it to the back side and hand sew it down. I will pick a spot on the bottom, not directly in the middle of the bottom, but off to the side a little bit, but enough away from the corner that I can still, when I get down to the end, I can still piece my binding back together. So I'm going to start right about here with my binding. I am going to need my pins, and I'm going to need my seam gauge in order to do my corners. So we're going to put a walking foot on the machine. A walking foot just helps you not to push one layer over the other. It's a little bit easier to put your binding on through your layers so that you don't end up with bubbles. Alright, we're ready to go there. And I am going to lengthen my stitch length to 2.5. My needle is in my center position. I may need to adjust that, but we're going to check a little seam allowance first. So I'm going to sew this on the front side. So when I get prepared to get started, I'm going to leave about 4 or 5 inches of my binding before I actually put it onto the quilt. So my edge of my binding is here. I'm going to start right here with my sewing. That gives me enough when I get down to the end to be able to piece that binding back together. Now I am going to run along the edge of my walking foot over here, and so I may need to adjust my seam allowance a little bit. We're going to check this. I think having it in the center is going to be a little bit too big of a seam allowance. So I'm going to move my needle over to 5.5, and I'm going to run along the edge of that walking foot. So let's just sew a little bit, and then we will check our fold over and make sure that we have it where we want it. Okay, and I just lay my binding on top of the quilt like that. I'm not stretching anything, I'm just laying it down nice and gently, and it will just stitch right in place. Okay, let's stop there, and we'll take this out and we will check it for my seam allowance. So what I'm looking for is I want to be able to, when I pull this over this direction and pull it to the back side, I want that binding to be nice and full. And so I want that edge of that binding just to be right about where that seam line is with my bobbin thread so that I can hand sew it down. This seam allowance looks pretty good. I'll be able to keep my binding nice and full when I do this. So I'm going to slide it back in, and I'm going to just overlap my stitches a little bit instead of back stitching. So we're going to continue until we get close to a corner. So all of my raw edges are matching up. My fold of my binding is over on this left-hand side. Alright, as I'm approaching this corner, I'm going to take my seam gauge and I'm going to mark my seam gauge with my seam allowance that I've used. So I'm going to slide this over here, and I'm going to put the edge of my seam gauge on my seam allowance, and then I'm going to use this slide bar to push up right against the edge of my binding. So this is going to be how far away from this corner that I have to stop in order to keep my seam allowance going down the side. So that's going to be an important measurement to keep track of, and I like to keep track of it by marking my seam gauge, and then that way I know I'm consistent every single corner. So what I'm going to do is we'll get a little bit closer to that corner, and then I'm going to use my seam gauge with my slider right up against that other side, the next side edge, and I'm going to put a pin right at the top of that measurement. So this is my seam allowance that I've been using to sew my binding on. So that tells me the point I need to stop when I get to this corner. So I'm going to continue. And as I approach that corner, I'm going to make sure that I watch that pin, and I think I'm right there. So in order to double check myself on this, I'm going to turn the quilt, and when I turn it and line this up right here, then it should be lined up with the edge of my walking foot. So when I make my fold on my corner, I can just continue down, and it does feel like it's going to line up exactly. So once I turn my quilt, I'm going to put my presser foot down, and I'm going to back stitch completely off of my binding. Okay. I do not have to cut my threads at this point unless it's easier for you to make this fold without it being so close to the machine. So I'm going to pull it out, and I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to fold it back. So if you notice right here, I'm folding it back on itself, and my things that I need to look for to line up are that my raw edges of my binding here are going to come straight down along the edge of my quilt right here. Okay, so that should be a continuous line going up. This edge over here should be 90 degrees, and then this edge right here should be 45 degrees. So you're going to fold it back like this to start with, okay? And then you're going to bring that binding back down and fold it so that this edge lines up, and my fold at the top, I'll pin this so you can see here. My fold at the top is right along that previous edge that I sewed. So this is the fold of the binding when I pulled it back and brought it back down. And then this edge over here is covered up, so this was the 90-degree edge. This is covered up with the fold of the binding as I continue down this side. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and slide it back under our foot, and we're going to continue down the side of this, applying this binding to the side of the quilt. So we'll keep going till we get to the next corner. As I approach this next corner, I'm going to repeat this process. I still have my seam gauge marked with my seam allowance, so I'm going to put my slider bar against the next side straight edge, the trimmed edge that you have, and I'm going to put a pin in at the end of my slide measurement. I'm going to sew right to where that pin is. And I'm going to stop with my needle in my quilt, rotate, double check that I'm going to line up right here, and I'm going to back stitch off. Okay, let the machine sit with the needle down. Just go ahead and pull that forward, and then do your fold. Straight back with your binding with all my raw edges lining up in one straight line, 45 degrees here, 90 degrees here. Then I'm going to bring that binding back down. My fold is at the top, and my edge over here is covered up with that other 90 degree. Now if you notice, I have a seam right there from when I joined my binding strips together. That is not ideal. I do not typically pre-measure my binding all the way around for my placement, and so once in a while I do get a seam on that corner. But if you want to lay your binding out all the way around and check and make sure you're not going to have a seam in the corner, you can do that as well. So we're going to now continue to the next corner. One other note that I will make here is when you're applying your binding, it's important that you have a table to support your quilt. You don't want that pulling against you as you're trying to sew this binding on. I also do have to stop and adjust as I go to make sure that that quilt is supported. Now that we have rounded this last corner, I am going to determine how close I need to be to the starting point before I quit sewing so I have room to join these strips together. And I am going to stop right about here. So I'm going to place a pin right there so I know where to stop stitching. And I am going to back stitch on this one and then cut my thread off so I can take it out of the machine. So let's go over to the board where I can show you how to join these ends of this binding. So what we're going to do is we have quite a bit of space in between these two that I left open, about 8.5 inches or so I left open. So we need to join these two strips together on the diagonal, just like we joined our strips when we created our binding. So the easiest way to do this, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the start of my strip down nice and flat on my quilt. And I'm going to determine, I need to trim a little bit of this off, so I'm going to determine that maybe I need to take about 1.5 inches off of there. Now you can do this with the scissors, or you can do it with your rotary cutter if you know. A lot of times if I'm at the machine, I will just snip that off with my scissors. But basically I have a little bit longer than I need over here and not enough space in between to work with that. So I'm going to take my next piece, the ending strip, and I'm going to lay that down nice and flat on the edge of my quilt. And then I'm going to place a pin right where these two pieces meet. And so you can see right here is the edge of my start binding. And so I'm going to place a pin in the top part, the end piece coming around, right where those two binding pieces will meet. The next thing I'm going to do is this strip that I cut off is going to be my measuring tool. And so I'm going to open it up and place the one cut edge against the pin that designates where the two pieces meet. And I'm going to make it lay nice and flat there. And I'm actually going to trim it just shy, so maybe 1/16 of an inch shy from where the full width of this binding strip is. So if you can see where I have my full strip and where I have marked that line over here where I'm going to cut. So now I can unpin these and I can trim this binding right on that line that I marked. Okay. So now I have to treat this just the same as when I was joining my other binding strips together. Remember that your quilt needs to be in your lap. So basically your quilt needs to be closest to you when you do this. So this piece opened up, this is the last piece coming around the corner, is going to be my left hand side, right side up, and this piece here that I started with is going to make my upside down L. Now this is going to be a problem in here because it's pulling against me. So the first thing I'll do is I'll take this up and I'll just fold it like this and put a pin in it. And that takes away from that pulling. So now I can take this strip coming from the left and I'm going to lay it face wrong side down, so face up. And then I'm going to take this next piece and I'm going to put it in my upside down L. Okay. And I am going to pin those on all four corners. Pinning it in 4 corners just assures me that I've kept everything lined up. Okay. There we go. And then I am going to sew from this corner to this corner. Okay, just the same as when I was putting all of my strips together. So if I lay this down here and I mark it, I'm actually putting my ruler on the opposite side here, and I have those pins in there, which makes it a little bit crazy with holding that ruler down. So I'm going to actually tip my ruler and push down on it on the edge that I need to mark, and then draw a line from corner to corner. Okay, and there is my line that I am going to sew on. Okay, now let's go ahead and go back to the machine and we will sew that seam. My needle is off center, so I'm lining it up where the needle is going to be right on that line I drew. And I do have to go a little bit slower with the walking foot, because the walking foot really does like to use thicker layers when you sew it together. It gets a little bit maybe out of alignment here when I'm just trying to sew 2 pieces of cotton together. So I have to tell myself just to go a little bit slower. All right. Okay, and then I can take out the rest of the pins. Okay, so I can also take out this pin that was holding my quilt out of the way. Okay, let's go back over to the table and let's finish this off. So once I have that sewn together, then I can lay it out like this, and I can double check and make sure that it's going to lay out nice and smooth. Now I still have this piece in here to take care of, and so you can take care of this 2 ways. You can either go to the ironing board and just do a real quick press on this, or you can do a finger press, what we would call a finger press. I'm just going to take it to the iron board real quick and just do a press right through there. Okay, and then I'm going to bring this up like that, back on that edge, and I'm going to do another press there. Now I do have to trim that out, that extra fabric. I do need to trim that out of here. And so I'm going to do this very carefully with the rotary cutter. I have it laid nice and flat, and I'm just going to guesstimate that 1/4 inch, okay, and get that sewn off of there. So now my seam will be open, and I'll lay that nice and flat. At this point, I do pin this to the quilt because I want to make sure I know how much tension that I need to put on this as I sew that together. And you shouldn't have to put very much, but it's just a pre-planning. So I'm going to start over here where I ended, and I'm going to overlap my stitches and come down here and finish off where I actually started with applying this binding. So we'll get that done, and then we'll be ready to hand sew. And that finishes off nicely. No extra fabric in there, it just lays down nice and smooth. Get rid of a few extra threads here, and we'll be ready to start our hand sewing. Now, in order to start this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this edge out. I do have a cotton batting in here, and so I can do this step. If you have a polyester batting or a more fluffy batting, you do not want to press this out. I just have found that if I press that edge out with using cotton batting, it makes it a little bit easier to pull it around to the back side and do my hand stitching. Okay, all the way around, I've pressed that seam out, that binding out, and so now I am ready to start hand sewing this to the back side. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this binding around and I'm going to pin it so that the fold of the binding just barely covers the bobbin thread when I stitch that binding on. So I'm going to show you how to get started and how to do a corner, and then the rest of it takes a little while. So you're not going to see that finish on the video. We're just going to show this much. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with pinning. When you get to this corner, take your thumb and just push it in so that you're pushing the quilt part of it back into the binding and bringing that binding around to the back side. So I'm going to put a couple more pins in. We've got one on this side, and then this side does want to pull against me when I'm folding this corner. So I'm going to bring this over and I'm going to do the same thing on this side and put a couple of pins in it as I get to this corner. So I'm making sure that I'm just covering my bobbin thread. Okay. Now this corner piece here, I want to tuck all that stuff in there, and the side that I'm going to go second is the piece that I'm going to have folded down on the bottom here. So I'm going to bring that over so that it's straight across my corner there, and I'm going to place a pin at an angle just barely going in so that it holds that piece coming down. And then this is the piece I'm going to fold. So if I push that back into there, and then this edge of my binding I'm going to fold up so that I have a nice mitered corner. Now I may have to make some adjustments, and I can see I need another pin right here. You may have to adjust how much you have into this corner here. And so if this piece on the bottom is coming straight over, this is the top piece that you can adjust. And so sometimes we have to either tuck more under there or tuck less. In this case, we need to tuck a little bit less. So I'm going to make that adjustment, and I'm going to place a pin, get that lined up there. I'm going to place a pin in there to hold that in place. And so you can see how I have that folded there, and so I've got my mitered corner going there, and my pieces up here of my binding make a really nice corner piece. So now we're going to do the hand sewing. I do use a thimble, but I put that thimble on my middle finger. That's the one that I tend to push the needle through with. And so I have the thimble on my middle finger. I have already threaded a needle with my thread. And what I do is I take a length of thread, and if you can see right here, this is where my thread is folded in half. So that's my bottom loop of my thread, and I actually have threaded my needle with the cut ends right through here, and that allows me to make a knot when I get started on my binding. So if I tip this back, then I can see where that bobbin thread was, and it makes it easier to do this hand sewing and keep it hidden then. So I am going to take just a little bite into the batting. I'm not going all the way through to the front. So I'm taking just a little bite right above my bobbin thread with my needle, and as I bring that up, I am going to watch for my loop of my thread. Okay, there it is. There's my loop. I'm going to take my needle and go right through that loop of thread and pull it snug. And that makes my starting knot for me. Now, the next step, I will grab a hold of the back side of that binding. I'm not coming around to the front. I'm just grabbing a hold of the back part of that binding. And then I'm going to swing over and grab a little bit of my backing and my batting right above my bobbin thread line. And if I'm really careful, I can swing over and pick another edge up on the back side of my binding and then come right up on that fold. And if I pull my threads up snug then, and when I let go, I can't see any of my stitching. So I'm going to move over to where we can get a little bit of a closer view by the machine and show these steps to you. I'll just move my machine out of the way here. Alright, and let's see if we can have a little bit of a closer view here. So if I bend that binding back, then it exposes my bobbin thread. And so I can grab a little bite of my backing and batting, and then I can swing over and catch the back side of the binding on that fold. And then go back and catch another little bite. If I'm really good, I can get 4 stitches. So I can get a backing bite, a binding, backing, and binding. And then I pull that up nice and snug. And when it's all done, you can't see any of your stitching. So the trick is that you're bending this back and you're catching a little bit of back, a little bit of the back side of the fold of the binding, backing, and binding, and then coming up in the fold of that binding. As I approach the corner, I'm going to go into the batting and backing, and then I'm going to come up and catch that point of the top layer of the binding. So I can catch that point and snug it in, and then I'm going to go down into the backing, and I'm going to come up and catch the point of the other side of the binding. And I'm just going to make a loop and do that step one more time, coming from the point of the first side, and I'll come through the batting and backing and catch the point on the second side. And just snug those 2 points up together. Once I've done that, then I can continue down the next side of the binding. Now when it's time for me to get a new piece of thread, then I will go into the backing part, and I'll make a little loop and make a knot. I'll do that a couple of times, and then I will run the needle into the batting and pull it up a little bit further away before I cut the tail off, before I cut that thread. And then I will start a new piece of thread just like I showed you at the beginning of this. So we'll continue. Once in a while my stitches do slip off of my needle, and I do find with a little bit of a thinner needle and a shorter needle, sometimes I can get a little bit better on my stitches going back and forth. And we'll just continue down until we get all the way around the quilt. So that is how we're going to do the hand binding. And when it's all done, then you don't see any of your stitches. Pin's in the way. So I'll go until I'm at the end of my pin, and then I'll stop and I'll pin a little bit more in place. If you don't like to use pins, the other product that works really nice is the Wonder Clips. And so you can use the Wonder Clips and clip a little ways, and once they're all removed, then you can clip some more and sew some more. And from the front side, that is the way that that corner is going to look. So it's going to be a nice mitered corner on the front and a nice mitered corner on the back. So that concludes our basic binding video. If you have any questions or any comments, please let us know. Our website is www.backdoorquiltshop.com. Shop is spelled S-H-O-P-P-E. You can also find us on Facebook for additional videos, little tips, tutorials, sale items, all kinds of postings on our Facebook page. So be sure to check it out. Thank you for joining us today.